Hello, and welcome to another episode of Breadcast Gaming Talk. Since it was on sale and I really didn't want to go straight into Warhammer the End Times Vermintide 2, I decided to give Chaosbane a try. I chose this because it's an action RPG like Diablo 3 and Warhammer 40k Inquisitor Martyr, a game I recently played and enjoyed. So for this episode, I'm going to be giving my thoughts on Warhammer Chaosbane. To not compare this game to Diablo 3, I would not be talking about this game in the correct manner. That is the reason why I bought this game, because it looked like it played like Diablo 3, but the weird thing is that I find Chaosbane to be less interesting than Diablo 3 is, and I've put a good chunk of hours into Diablo 3. Chaosbane is by no means a bad game, it's just not too interesting. I found this with the first Warhammer the End Times Vermintide game. It's like Left 4 Dead 2, and yet I find Left 4 Dead 2 to be the more interesting game. Anyway, so I picked the dwarf character because, I like my straight up melee characters in fantasy games. I guess in the Warhammer world, dwarves don't wear any kind of armor, which I guess makes them a little unique. He doesn't wear a helmet or chest armor or any kind of heavier armor, to be frank. He's shirtless, has tattoos, wears regular pants and shoes. The only armor is on the wrists, and that's kind of it. The dwarf also only uses 2 axes, and there's different kinds of axes you can have, but you don't get the option of a sword and an axe and a mace, a sword and a mace, stuff like that. It's just axes. Also, the voice for the dwarf is good, but it's kind of like a stereotypical fantasy dwarf with that deep Irish accented kind of voice. I don't know how to describe it, but that's what I draw the parallels to. A lot about this dwarf just screams stereotypical fantasy dwarf, which is fine. It's just not wholly original for the character. Now, the atmosphere in Chaosbane is a little darker than Diablo, since people think Diablo 3 is too cartoony. I am not one of those people. I say darker because things look darker in Chaosbane, but it lacks the blood and gore that Diablo 3 has, and it's not required, but it's kind of fun when you're just hacking your way through various groups in the Grand Alliance Chaos, whatever they call it, Grand Chaos Alliance, I don't know. Speaking of the enemies, that is an area where this game would get points off if I did points for these kinds of things. Like with Diablo 3, there's different areas that have different enemies, but each area will generally have the same grouping of enemies. Diablo 3 areas would have 5 or 6 different enemy types per area, but with Chaosbane there's 3 or 4. For instance, the second area you go to in Chaosbane, the enemies you face are rats, cultists, fleshhounds, and bloodletters. There's one variation of bloodletters that is carrying a corn banner, and sometimes there are blood crushers, and the occasional, very occasional exalted deathbringer, I think is what they are. But more often than not, it's rats, cultists, fleshhounds, and bloodletters, and those enemies are persistently in all of the quest areas in that second area. The final thing is that the overarching story doesn't exist. In Diablo 3, everything you did was going towards the game's story as a whole. With Chaosbane, you go to one area, do some quests, go to the next area, do those quests, and nothing connects. Everything feels really disjointed, and it makes me wonder what is the importance of any of this at all. Overall, Warhammer Chaosbane really just sits right in the middle of everything. It's very much like Diablo, which is fine with me, yet somehow isn't as interesting as Diablo 3. The game isn't bad, but it's not great either. I thought that maybe it would scratch that itch that Diablo 3 does, but I can just play Diablo 3 anytime that I want to. Warhammer Chaosbane, it's just kind of an average game. Normally, this is when I would conclude the video, but I wanted to talk about what I want in a Warhammer video game. Currently, The most fun Warhammer video game I've played is Inquisitor Martyr, and yes, I still need to get around to Vermintide too. I know that, Warhammer in the tabletop game is all turn-based strategy, so you think that turn-based strategy would be the best video game type for Warhammer. I disagree because I think that, especially for Age of Sigmar, an RPG game works perfectly. I think instead of doing the isometric style, Diablo 3 like, just do a regular third person RPG. I think they need to make a video game in the Age of Sigmar universe that is what, Space Marine is to the 40k universe. Take a good RPG like Kingdoms of Amalur or The Witcher 3 and put it in Age of Sigmar, incorporate more of the other factions within the Grand Alliance chaos, like the Disciples of Teznich, I don't know how to say that, or the Hedonites of Slanesh and the Slaves to Darkness. Go beyond that and, grab enemies from the Grand Alliance Death and Grand Alliance Destruction, too. I mean, how cool would it be to have a boss fight with a Terrorgeist? But yeah, that's what I would want from a Warhammer video game set within the Age of Sigmar world. In terms of 40k, take more games like Inquisitor Martyr or Space Marine. You don't need to do an FPS because I feel like Warhammer, you should see the character that you are and how cool they look. That's all I have to say, so if you're into this conversation, leave a comment below. As always, thanks for listening, and goodbye.